Hi, I'm Gabriela Houston. Welcome to my channel where we discuss storytelling in all its forms. It's my belief that storytelling is an intrinsic part of everyone's life, as well as an important part of many professions. On the show, I talk to writers, artists, journalists, researchers, and more about how they use storytelling in their jobs and life. Every other week, there's something different, so click like and subscribe for more. It really helps the channel. Maybe that cheeky notification bell as well. Today's guest is Susan de Guardiola. Susan is a social dance historian, teacher, and caller, and the author of the dance history blog Capering and Kickery. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Susan.
You're welcome. I'm very happy to be here.
So I saw Susan give a talk on the history of quadrille at this last August Worldcon, and I was just so impressed with Susan's knowledge and passion for the subject. So, can you tell us, Susan, about like how you actually chose this specialism, like a dance historian? How did you get into it?
Well, actually, I didn't really get into it through either the dance or the history. What originally interested me was making costumes. I
Okay.
really enjoyed what would now be called cosplay, making costumes and having occasions to wear them. And I had a friend who was very interested in going to Victorian balls, things like that. And I thought, well, this is a great chance to make a costume and wear it. So at first, for me, honestly, it was all about the clothing. It wasn't
Which is
until
fair, which is absolutely fair.
yeah, I mean,
It's
it's the
beautiful
sort of
clothing.
Cinderella complex. There is, I'm going to get dressed up in a ball gown and go to a ball. Um, it wasn't until I was introduced to the actual primary source material that the fact that I was a history-oriented research person at university suddenly clicked in. And I just became intrigued by the fact that there was a record, a historical record of this material that could be studied. And I sort of went down the rabbit hole on this topic, and I never came out of the rabbit hole. And now I have no time to make costumes anymore because I'm always doing
Oh,
research instead.
well, that is sad because you're learning all those dances. You should be able to show them off in proper costume.
Yeah, you're
So,
very right.
so which sort of, you started somewhere, like which time period and location interests you the most? Because, when we say dance, like every nation, every ethnic group in history danced. So what's your specialism?
So my specialty is Western European dance. I started with the English Regency era, the Jane Austen stuff, what today is the Bridgerton stuff. Um, I also have a strong interest really in the whole 19th century. And because my teacher told me to understand the period, you need to understand the period before that, I've sort of drifted back into the late 18th century as well. I mostly work on French and English dance, but during the pandemic, while I had really no access to French and English libraries except online, I spent a lot of time working on American dance, and I've become fascinated by the connections, particularly between French and American dance, that I hadn't really been aware of before.
So that is a very sort of a wide specialism.
I started with the entire world and all of history, and I feel like I've narrowed it down to like
Yes.
150 years and three countries. I thought that's pretty good.
I mean, when you put it like that, then definitely. So how do you like conduct your research? Because you say you came across these like source materials. What kind of source materials do we have in order to uncover how people danced?
So the basic source materials are that since at least the 15th century, people have been writing dance treatises. They've been writing books, how-to manuals on how to dance. So you can get a good idea from these books of how dancing masters thought you were supposed to dance. Now, there's obviously a problem with that, as anybody who's ever taught anything or been taught anything knows, which is there's the ideal that the dancing masters wanted, and then there's what people actually did. They're not always distant, but we also have enough supporting evidence in the form of memoirs, diaries, correspondence, descriptions of events, um, all of this sort of ephemera that goes with the official prescribed stuff, that we can get some idea of what people actually did. And often it matches up to what the dancing masters wrote. I find that every time I think this dancing master is crazy, nobody would have done that. And then I find some supporting evidence where people said, yes, we did do that. Like, okay, he wasn't crazy. Obsessive maybe, but not crazy, crazy.
But how do
So
you interpret it from, because they were using mostly French terminology, right? For the description of the movements. How do you interpret what they actually wrote in those manuals to how it corresponds to how we understand the movement now?
well, it depends on the form of dancing you're doing. If you're doing the type of dance that you see like in a Jane Austen movie where you have a large group of people moving around the floor in pretty patterns, then we have books that describe and diagram those patterns. They actually show like pictures with floor tracks. And we have other books which describe in fairly good detail the steps that were used for those, what you're actually doing with your feet. By that time, often in what would now look like ballet type terminology, describing first position, second position, using terms that are recognizably the same as are used in ballet, although sometimes the exact meaning has shifted over time. So combining the two, you can often come up with a fairly good idea of what they were actually doing. Obviously, there are other times when you can't quite narrow it down quite as much, or you have the figures but not the steps, or the steps but not the figures. And then you have to do a little bit of guesswork, extrapolation, crossing your fingers and hoping you've got it right. It's not an
Yeah.
exact science. It's not mathematics. And I get asked a lot, well, what's the right way to do this? What is the specific answer? And I have to give one of those long footnoted answers that say, well, there's lots of possibilities, and these are my best guesses, and these are the reasons for them.
But that's
Because
like with any
often,
historical research, isn't it?
yes, pretty much.
The whole of anthropology is basically making educated guesses, isn't it?
Yeah.
Um, so I was wondering, like, so does like understanding, because you started with being interested in costumology, so does understanding how the clothing was structured like help with interpreting those movements that you described in the dances?
Oh, yes. So I find it critically important when you're doing a performing art to actually perform it. Just like you can't learn completely about music just by looking at a score and never actually hearing the music or performing the music. For women, especially, because historically women's clothing has been more restrictive and has varied considerably more. Men's clothing has not changed in its real essence in several hundred years, whereas women's clothing has gotten bigger and smaller, or narrower, more corseted and less corseted. Um, Actually trying to perform the dances in the clothing of the time can give you a lot of insights, and it can also give you some idea of what may have been more ideal than practical. For example, in the 16th century, saying, well, if you do this, you can dance in shoes that are like 4 fingers high, as if they were much shorter. If you try to actually do those steps in what are basically clogs that are 4 fingers high, you discover that it's quite difficult to actually do that.
But I suppose practice makes perfect, because if I try, like,
Does.
I couldn't do anything in clogs. I very much doubt I could walk length of my street in clogs.
Yeah,
So
they were called
might just be
chopines,
me.
and they were these sort of
Like
like
platform
platform
shoes.
shoes.
Yeah.
Yes, yes, and it's quite challenging to try to do those kind of steps in those. Um, and you also see changes in the steps that go along with the costume. For example, in the early 19th century, when you've got the Jane Austen era, the Empire line, where the dresses are usually fairly slim, you've got a lot of bouncier steps. People are hopping and jumping. And then later in the century, when women's gowns have become enormous and they're supported by hoop skirts, crinolines, bustles, most of that hopping, not all, goes away in the sort of group dances. And if you try doing it in those, you'll discover that one effect of all the hopping is that your crinoline goes boingy, 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 boingy,
Yeah.
which is very silly. So
Yes.
it's
It's
hard to
hard to
tell.
romance people when you look like a slinky, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, yes, that's a good way of saying it. So it's hard to tell whether the change in steps was because of the change in costume or it paralleled it. If you go early or later into the early 20th century, at the beginning of the century, women's corsetry is very structured, steel bones, long down on the hips. And then you have very explicitly, well, the tango is now in fashion, and you can't do a tango in this kind of corset. So you get explicit recommendations to use the new like elastic corsets, the ancestor of girdles, basically,
Mm.
because in those you're able to actually do these dances that you just can't do in the old-fashioned style. So people talk about it very explicitly.
Yeah, that is very interesting. And I was just thinking, so basically, so we've covered the like costumology as an element of research. So what does history of dance cover in terms of other areas of expertise?
Oh my gosh, this is why I say I will never ever ever get to the end of it, and I will never ever be bored with my work. Um, most what I use most is I'm doing general history and social history, etiquette, because that is often entwined with dance, both etiquette in the ballroom and because dance teachers often also taught etiquette, and etiquette teachers were involved in etiquette for the ballroom. I use multiple languages. Mostly I read in English and French, but I've also been known to be muddling around in Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and Russian. And occasionally a teeny bit of German, but I can't make much headway on German usually.
Yeah, I mean, Google Translate can help a little bit, I hope.
It can help a little bit, but it can be defeated by specialist language.
Hmm.
Like historically, in many languages, the gentleman was referred to as the cavalier, and Google Translate will helpfully tell me that's a knight, like a knight in shining armor. You get weird things like in German, the men were sometimes referred to as chapeau, as hats, and you see like little hat pictures representing the men. So Google will tell you all about what your hat does on the dance floor. So there's lots of little problems like that. So I do use Google Translate extensively, but I have to be very careful with it and use historical dictionaries also to sort of
Okay.
back that up. So I do those. I have to look at music. I have to look at costume. I was trained as a genealogist by my grandfather when I was a child. My grandfather was a passionate genealogist back before the internet. So I use a lot of
Okay.
genealogy to sort of,
Amazing. Tell me about that. Tell me about how it fits in.
well, I'll often find a mention of somebody. And I'll give you a couple of examples. There's a woman in the 19th century, mid 19th century in London, great dance mistress, published 9 editions of a book, collaborated with music publishers, performed with another dancing master who is well known. And all I had was Mrs. Nicholas Henderson, which is frustrating because, okay, that was the etiquette then, but I wanted to know her name, not her husband's. So I went into genealogy material and found her marriage records, her family records, her father, her daughters, her husband, and found this whole story about the young daughter of a French emigre officer who married a music master, had 2 small children, and while she was the mother of 2 toddlers, was already writing a book, running a dance business, and performing at major balls attended by the nobility. And I think of it as like, wow, this is a Victorian working mom, with like a 3-year-old and a 2-year-old, and somehow she's doing all this, and eventually roped her daughters into being her assistant teachers. And after her death, one of her daughters continued advertising herself as the daughter of Mrs. Henderson, continued teaching dance. So if I just looked at the books she wrote, it wouldn't have told me any of this about her. Or I'll give you one more anecdote and then I'll stop, I promise. I find a book written by a French dancing master that's a wonderful source for how to dance what would have been the earlier form of quadrilles going back another 30 or 40 years, dedicated to a young woman. And after digging around, I find that it's very interesting that a married dancing master with a whole bunch of children, dedicated a book to his teenage student. But it gets better, fulfilling the stereotype of the dancing master. When divorce was briefly legal after the French Revolution, he divorced his wife, the mother of his umpteen children, and married his teenage student after she'd already borne him one illegitimate child. So all
Oh,
the bits
wow.
about, dancing masters seducing their pupils, well, here's sort of exhibit A of a guy actually doing this.
Well,
And I would
spilling
never have
all
known,
the tea 200 years later, isn't
yeah,
it?
and I would never have known if I hadn't looked up his genealogical information and then her genealogical information. And the two of them getting the names and then finding their marriage record, and then you go back like, wait, wasn't he married to someone else? Oh, they had a divorce. My God, an 18th century divorce.
That is, yeah, that's brilliant. It's just,
Yeah. And the human
yeah.
stories behind it just
Mm.
fascinate me. And there's so many of them.
Yes, of course. I mean, any person, like individually, when you look into someone like real deep, there's
Mm-hmm.
just like an universe unto themselves, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And it's of course like that really relies on the like records being kept
Yes.
well, and people not changing their names to pretend to be like a French master if they're like
Oh,
born
that
in
happens.
Sussex or something.
Oh, that definitely happens.
Yeah.
There are recorded instances of dancing masters who've changed their name, pretended to be from some exotic place. Um, yeah, or a problem with female dancing masters, and I'm especially interested in female teachers, female choreographers, female creators, is they're easy to lose historically. There's one that I've been very interested in who taught in New York in the 1840s, but I only have a first name. So when the advertisements mentioning her stop,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, is that because she went back to France? Is it because she got married? Is it because she died or retired? It could be
Mm.
any of these, but with women especially, if you don't have a lot of data to start with, it can be very hard to trace them through history because they vanish in these various ways.
Yeah, I imagine that requires a lot of travel as well to be able to access all those records. Or more, maybe like more and more libraries digitalize everything.
More and more libraries digitalize things, more and more genealogical information is digitized, although a lot of it is behind paywalls, which is aggravating also. But yes, I do spend quite a lot of time sitting in libraries. I joke that I go to England. Well, I went for an event, but actually the reason I went was that I could put 4 days in the library before and after the event. So that justifies the trip.
I mean, absolutely. So,
There's a lot that's not like cataloged in libraries or
yeah.
not digitized yet. Google Books can't get to everything.
So, I mean, like, searching into the genealogy and like the like records of people, that in itself is an incredible bit of storytelling that is involved in your research. I was going to ask because I have a fair bit of like writers sort of listening in. Um, and we you mentioned etiquette, right? And there's bits of etiquette of surrounding dance and balls that people are more familiar with thanks to like Jane Austen era books, or like the TV series, the movies, like if a gentleman asks a woman to dance in Regency England and she rejects him, then she mustn't dance another dance for a whole evening. Are there like
No.
lesser?
Sorry, go on.
Oh, is that not true?
No, it's really not. We
Oh, really?
we have a problem. Presentism doesn't quite describe it. Victorianism describes it in some ways, that we tend to assume that the old-fashioned manners that are still not in living memory, but in relatively recent memory, which tends to be very Victorian in
Hmm.
style, that those went back further, that it was always like that or maybe worse. When in practice it wasn't necessarily. You can't assume that the manners of mid-19th century middle-class America actually applied very far back. You know, if you look back to 16th century Italy, you see that, well, what is the etiquette for a woman asking a man to dance? And one of the things it talks about is, well, it's important for the woman to raise her eyes to make eye contact with the man she wants to ask to dance, because if she doesn't make eye contact, several men at once might jump up thinking that she's asking them. So it's important to do that. So that implies a whole society where the idea of a woman asking a man to dance is not unusual. You know, the only problem is that she might be too modest or too shy to actually look up.
So, but she invites him by making eye contact, which is such a risky move. Because
she'd have to speak too.
I remember going to
like
dance clubs and just like avoiding making any eye contact with people.
Yeah, that was like my 6th grade cotillion lessons, where all the girls are on one side and the boys are on the other, and neither of us want to actually look at each other. So I sympathize. So you can't make that assumption going backward.
You know? It's interesting. So basically, you're telling me I have to throw out my Jane Austen era etiquette book out.
Yeah, or at least get an actual etiquette book of the period, you know, where you'll see fascinating tidbits, you know, like gentlemen should not dance with each other if there are ladies available to dance with. You know, what does that imply? That they had to make a rule against men dancing with each other if ladies were available? You know, or you look at Jane Austen's letters where she talks about dancing with another woman and says, oh yes, there were other couples of women dancing together, but most of them were not as amiable as we were.
Yeah.
You know, and it's hard to know if they were amiable about dancing with each other or they weren't amiable in general. You know, but again, what does this imply?
Kitty Bennet can only stand with one of her sisters if she wants to dance after her sister elopes. Yeah.
Or an English actress traveling to America who waltzed with a man on the trip over. And that caused such a scandal that she said, well, when I get to America, I'm only going to dance with other women when I waltz. I won't dance with men because that scandalizes people. It's better to just dance with women. And this is in the middle of the 19th century. Victorian America. So
that's fascinating. It's like so it's basically one of those things that like somebody must have misunderstood something. If you're saying that like women could say no to that, like in Regency England, to dancing with a man and then continue dancing with someone else, well, that must be so it must be one of those things that people just like heard and then just keep repeating until it becomes fact in everyone's mind.
Yeah. Yeah. And in Regency novels, I don't think that is from Georgette Heyer, but Georgette Heyer, who sort of created the genre of Regency romance, did a lot of good research. And then she also just sort of put in a lot of her own stuff. But a lot of people feel, well, if it was in Georgette Heyer, it must be accurate. So it's then repeated over and over to the point where it can be hard to figure out where some of this comes from. But most of it is very commonsensical. The rule about saying no and then not dancing is more from the middle of the 19th century. And
so it was a rule just later.
Well, sort of. You know, it's really a politeness rule that first, if a woman refuses to dance with you, a man should not ask her for reasons. He should just accept that and go away. And secondly,
it's a rule to live by in all ways, isn't it?
Yes, is maybe don't ask a question you don't want to know the answer to. You know, but then is, yes, she could take another partner. And not for a whole evening. That was never a restriction, but for that dance, she could turn around and dance with someone else. But then the man should take note of this, which is to say, he's perfectly allowed to then judge her if she turned him down and then danced with someone else. You know, he can then think, okay, either she doesn't want to dance with me or she's a horribly rude person.
Well, we know which way many men would lean to when making that judgment. Am I unattractive or is she just terrible?
Yeah, but it's, you know, it's really sort of the same in a modern context. If you ask someone to dance and she says, well, my feet hurt, and then she doesn't dance, well, okay, maybe her feet really do hurt.
Yeah.
But if she then jumps up to dance with someone else, you're like, okay, well, she was lying, and you can either be a jerk about it and go and say, well, you lied to me. You said your feet hurt and now you danced with someone else. And you're really not going to get an answer that you want to hear if you do that.
Absolutely.
I mean, you can hear her say, well, actually, it's you. Or you can just say, okay, that one didn't work out. Let me go ask another person to dance.
Certainly.
So,
So, since the one thing I know about the etiquette of Regency England dancing turned out to be wrong, can you give me something else to supplement it? To supplement my knowledge of, what were the rules in Regency England?
well,
Like,
a good example is not to dance repeatedly with the same person.
so that's a
Dance,
real one. Okay.
yeah, when you see a dance on film, in a Jane Austen film, and mostly they're terrible. It hurts me to watch most of them. I just want to cry. What you don't see, because it's a film or a TV show, is that often the dances could go a long time. They could go 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 45 minutes with one person.
Mm-hmm.
And that often in the period, and this would vary between a private ball, a public assembly, a group of friends, casual dancing at home, but often you would do two dances in a row with one partner. So if you think that a dance might last half an hour and you do two dances in a row with one partner, you've just spent an hour with that person.
That's a solid coffee date, isn't it?
Yes. So if you then dance more dances with that person, you're spending a lot of time with them. It's not we danced for 3 minutes and then it was over. When
Mm-hmm.
in Pride and Prejudice, Mrs. Bennet describes the ball to her husband. She talks about, well, Jane danced, two dances with Mr. Bingley, and then two with someone, and two with someone, and then again with Mr. Bingley. That's sort of how you can tell there's something there, because she lists like four people that Jane danced with, and two
Mm,
of them are Mr. Bingley.
yeah.
That's an enormously significant lot of time they would have spent together.
Yeah. I mean, spent together, like bobbing up and down, like how much conversation can you squeeze in?
Well, that's another thing they don't quite get right, is that you actually have quite a lot of standing around in these dances. You're not
Mm.
actually jumping around the whole time. Um,
Yeah, because I mean, an hour of that sounds very athletic.
it's exhausting. I've danced down a set of 20 couples and I swear I was turning purple. I was so out of breath at the end of the set. But then, you start at the beginning and dance down, but as you're dancing up, you have a lot more dead time. And that's when all those wonderful flirtatious, and it wouldn't be while you're actually jumping around breathlessly trying to remember where you're supposed to be, like, that way, Mr. Collins sort of thing. It's in the dead bits between that. So,
Mm-hmm.
and depending on the dance, you might spend a third of your time not actually doing anything except quietly moving up the line. So there is some
Okay.
time there.
So
Yeah.
that puts for like, I believe we must have like at least a little bit of conversation, Mr. Darcy, in a different light, isn't it?
Yes. Yes, because you can't just stand there staring at each other, for the 20 minutes in an hour that you're not dancing at all.
Yeah, that's almost more intimate in a way, isn't it? It's a bit more invasive,
Yes.
just
Well,
someone staring into your eyes for half an hour.
yeah, and I mean it would be because this is something we don't appreciate fully in modern society, where we're allowed to go and talk to people we're romantically interested in. There's not a rule against being alone with someone, or even alone in a corner of a big room with someone. For them, they couldn't just casually do that as easily. So the fact that you're not dancing the whole time, that you have time to spend with this person, that's a plus. And it's another reason why, okay, there's not a rule against dancing with the same person over and over again. But if you do dance with the same person over and over again, it could mean something.
It signifies other things, isn't it?
And then, of course, because dance history is chaotic and there's no universal rules, you can get to a public ball in America in the early 19th century where you draw names out of a bowl, and that person whose name you draw is your partner for the whole evening. So it's
Oh no, that's like the most miserable Secret Santa ever.
Yes, yes. If you get a good person, it's great. If you don't, it's terrible. I have a letter from a young man down in the South. I can't remember, it was South Carolina or Georgia or whatever, who wrote back home describing a ball he went to, and talked about how he actually drew a good partner and he was happy about that. So
Oh, good.
so again,
Oh
generalizing, it's hard to do
no,
anything like
that's
universal.
see, it's like people think that, nobody must left feel out is a modern invention, but clearly
Mhm.
people have attempted to
Yeah.
orchestrate social situations that leave nobody else out way
Yes, and a
longer.
lot of the Victorian rules were meant to facilitate that. You wouldn't go to a ball and dance only with your wife or your close female friend because that's not social. At
Hmm.
a public event or even a private event, a ball with other people, you're supposed to mingle and dance with different people.
Hmm.
Women can't ask men to dance. That was their side of the etiquette. But the man's side of the etiquette is he should make a point of asking different women to dance.
Hmm.
And it's a system where you can't have just half of it. If you say, well, women can't ask men, well, then you have to give the men the obligation to
Yeah.
ask women, to ask the hostess to introduce them to different women. Otherwise, it doesn't work. So people like look at half the etiquette, but they don't look at the other half of the etiquette that made it a more or less functioning system, which
Yeah. I
doesn't
mean,
mean there weren't plenty of complained I went to the ball and nobody danced with me. That it doesn't work perfectly, but it doesn't work
yeah.
at all if you don't complete the circuit, so to speak.
Yeah, I think there's like it's people often latch on to like one side of it, which seems almost like unfair without seeing the mutuality in different systems. And it's like, in
Yes.
different cultural like relationships between like parents and children, for example, right? Like where the children are obligated towards their parents with sort of filial duty, but then there's the obligation on the parents that they are supposed to be like trying to make your life easier basically, and people sometimes forget that
Mm-hmm.
there is in a functioning system there's that mutuality.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to ask you sort of pulling on the sort of storytelling thread about, so we're talking a lot about Jane Austen, right? About like, we see in the books how someone dances
Mm-hmm.
tells the reader a lot about them. So, someone being light on their feet versus, of course, like, Elizabeth Benefit's cousin, Mr. Collins, being very
Yes.
clumsy.
Uh-huh.
Um, it's like an unpardonable offense. So, in like Jane Austen era, for example, or early Victorian, what did people deduce from how others dance? Like, what could you tell about a person beyond, they have no sense of rhythm?
Um, it's again something that does vary somewhat. I was just reading the memoir of a senior noblewoman at the French court who was active from the 1790s to the 1830s and blithely mentions that she's terrible at dancing. She just tosses this off. She goes to a lot of balls, but she never talks about her own dancing. So you can't generalize completely. Um, you would certainly want to have some basic amount of skill. I mean, one problem with Mr. Collins is not just that he's clumsy, but is that they're doing a group dance where it's important that everyone keep on their own little track, and he's blundering off his track. So it's not just that his feet aren't doing the right thing, is that he's messing up the sort of kaleidoscopic pattern of the dance. Um, those are separate skills in a way, being able to sort of place yourself spatially the way you need and being able to do fancy things with your feet. Um, Beyond a sort of basic level, you see more pressure and more anxiety when you see dances like the quadrille, where not everyone is moving at once, where you don't have the sort of camouflage of the group. Um, in the quadrille, there were parts where only two dancers danced, or only four dancers danced, or sometimes where only one person danced. And there was pressure in those because quadrille's a square dance, everyone else in your little square would be looking at you
Oh,
to
okay.
be able to execute something at least gracefully, even if it isn't the most complicated thing. And some of the sequences of steps that are published for quadrille dancing are ridiculously complicated, extremely difficult sequences. Some of them are much easier. So there's an opportunity there to show off, but there's also an opportunity for tremendous embarrassment if you don't do it right. And quadrilles in general caused a lot of social anxiety because they had to be memorized in a way that previous dances hadn't been. So there's a lot of talk about the pressure of quadrilles, rehearsing for the quadrilles. There's lots of wonderful caricature material, images of people making mistakes in quadrilles. So,
Mm.
and then you flip it around. If you look at Dickens, Charles Dickens, A Christmas Carol, Fezziwig's Ball, one of the most famous dancing in literature. This was written in the early 1840s, and it's a little bit vague exactly when it's supposed to take place, but sometime in the period when flashier footwork would have been the thing. But Mr. Fezziwig, they make not negative comments, but sort of amusement about this crazy old guy who's doing these jumping, hopping, pigeon wing steps, who's doing all this crazy stuff. How weird and old fashioned he is, but also how wonderful and jolly he is because he doesn't care that people think his steps are strange and old fashioned. He's having fun. He's going to do them anyway. So, it's going to vary a lot there. I would generally say that executing simple steps more effectively would tell someone something about you. Being ambitious would also tell someone something about you, but it would also depend on whether you were
Well, how
successful at it.
well you did that. Yeah.
Yeah, and of course the classic, the thing you don't want to do is to dance too well, because being a professional dancer, being a dancing master was not really a high status profession.
Mm.
And for a woman especially, being a professional dancer was both in perception and reputation, and to some degree in practice, highly overlapped with being a prostitute, because that was one of the ways you made it was your side hustle if you were a professional dancer. So dancing like a professional dancer is maybe not the best compliment you could pay someone, because it's sort
Mm-hmm.
of saying you're a great dancer just like a prostitute. Um, so it's sort of
Okay.
a thing is you don't necessarily want to look like you're a stage performer, because stage performers didn't necessarily have the best reputation.
I
So
see.
I'm sorry I'm not giving you a simple answer, but one of the
So
wonderful things about
well executed, like faint clumsiness is like, to once more, like, reassure everyone that your
say
reputation
feigned
is,
clumsiness. Yeah, I wouldn't say feigned clumsiness, but
yeah.
again, especially like with the English country dance, they would say, well, the steps should be few, simple, uncomplicated. Sticking out from the crowd that way wasn't necessarily a good
Mm.
thing in a group dance. And in quadrilles, it's a little harder to say, how much being an incredibly good dancer would have been necessary.
Mm.
And of course, by the Regency era, dancing masters were complaining that people only wanted to dance very simple dances, that they didn't want to do complicated dances anymore. And this is a variation on the eternal theme of young people these days, are,
Mm-hmm.
just not doing what they ought to be doing. They're not doing it the way we did it 25 years ago. So, and that is something
Yeah.
which is consistent all the way to the present day.
Yeah. Although I think people in the present day would be, well within the rights to note that we don't seem to do much social dancing anymore in the same way that, like, everybody danced.
We don't, we don't do it in that way, in that we don't, for the most part, have specific popular dances. I mean, really,
Mm.
ever since the 1960s or so, most social dancing, with occasional exceptions, um, And I don't mean niche things. Like, yes, there are still people who do country dances and contra dances. There is a large subset of swing
Mm.
dancers, salsa dancers. I mean, if you go to your average high school in America, your average teenage dance by people who are not in one of these niche dance communities, most of the dancing is standing individually and sort of thrashing around in place in various ways.
Hmm.
Or get to like the sort of slow dance where you hold on to your partner and sort of sway back and forth in place. I know that's what I did at my senior prom in high school. I
Yes,
either
it's a
by
perennial.
myself
It's
or
a
like
perennial. Yeah.
it's a perennial thing. And that's been the case for 60-ish years, maybe, since
Mm.
since the 1960s, really. Um, going back historically, you would have had two big differences. One is that the dancing would have had more specific technique. And the other is that it would have been a more core part of people's entertainment existence. The classic thing all the way up through the early 20th century is, well, let's push back the carpets and one of the daughters of the house will play the piano and let's dance,
Mm.
where it's a core skill. You had to make your own entertainment. People learned to play a musical instrument, they learned to dance, they learned to sort of make their own fun. Whereas nowadays, you don't have to do that.
Mm.
We have in order, we first got radio, then we got television, now we have the internet, we have video games, you can purchase professional entertainment.
Yeah.
You don't have to like write your own video games. Although when you look at things like Minecraft, and there's another one I'm blanking on, things like Minecraft, where people actually do enjoy sort of constructing their own worlds within this, you have to wonder if there isn't some hunger for a sort of creative level, role-playing games, Dungeons and Dragons, the live action kind, cosplaying, there's still that sort of bubbling artistic desire,
I
but it's
think
not
there's a shortage of
like,
like the third spaces now in a kind of
yes,
in our lives, isn't it? Like, I can't go down to my local community center every Saturday to dance, right? Like this doesn't exist anymore. And
you'd be
people, but
surprised.
well, I don't know, maybe in some places does still, but
I'm in
in
New England, so we still have a New England contra dance
mm,
tradition, which is a living
oh,
tradition.
nice.
So
Yeah.
I literally could go on Friday or Saturday to various places around Connecticut, and there would in fact still be contra dancing.
Oh, that's
Um,
nice. But yeah,
but it's
but in
not the
London, it's
typical
just
thing.
not like unless you do specialty, like you mentioned. But that is, I'm not mentioning that. We're talking like general population. And speaking of
Yes.
general population, like in the 90 sort of mid 19th century, um, I feel like dance was democratized, so everybody danced the same stuff. Like you if you dance like swing or you dance you know jive or things like that, like everybody, no matter which, and you didn't need a necessarily a dancing master for that. um but in the 19th century, in the sort of time that you specialize in, sort of Regency, like Victorian, how did people dance in different social classes? Like, what can you deduce from people about what dances they could do?
There's several things going on, and this is our knowledge on this is limited by the fact that for the most part, it's at worst the middle class and more the upper classes where people actually bother to write down what's happening.
Hmm.
Nobody is making a detailed record of the dances done by farmers in a village. It's you get bits and bobs here and there, but you don't get the kind of more thorough documentation you get. What we do see, and it's very noticeable between England and America, between the upper classes in England who had the time and the money to have dancing masters, to have dancing lessons, to enter a whole upper class social system of dancing with a level of sort of assumed skill, versus what you see in America, where outside the big cities, that kind of infrastructure, social and physical, for dance doesn't really exist. What you have is you have the dancing master and his fiddle who travel from town to town, stay for a few weeks, teach people a little bit of dancing, conduct a ball, and then move on to the next little town. because most places can't support all of that. So you see a different level of knowledge, a different level of skill required there. And I suspect it would have been a lot like that in lower classes in other countries as well. It's just more obvious in England and America, where you see the dancing, the same style of dancing split in these different milieus. Something you also see in the mid 19th century, especially, is in America an enormous desire for self-improvement. And this is not limited to dance. This happened across multiple things, whole series of books of how to learn X without a teacher. And you have a lot of books, how to learn dancing without a dancing master. So you end up with books that are aimed at dance teachers and callers to tell them how to do their job. And then you have books that are aimed at amateurs to tell them how to dance. And usually the way they want to dance is like people in Europe, where they sort of nationwide cultural inferiority complex in America for the first 75 to 100 years of its existence, where what they really wanted was to be like what they perceived as a superior culture, to dance like people in the courts of royalty and nobility, or at least in Europe somewhere. And then later in the 19th century, you sort of see a bit more American self-confidence developing. And the dancing doesn't just come from Europe, to America anymore. You sort of see America start to send dance backwards, start to initiate its own dance and music. And you get a little more cultural confidence there, where you don't see as much, we're dancing just like the Europeans, this is how to do it. You get to see, well, here's our dances and this is how we do them. And then you see the reverse of it with the Europeans writing careful treatises on how to dance just like an American in the early 20th century, as American dancers.
How exotic. Yeah.
Those strange Americans, what are they doing? It's actually quite useful, because the Europeans write things down that Americans didn't write down, because to them this was strange and exotic. Whereas the Americans were like, oh, well, we just do this. So, again, it varies over time, place.
Yeah, I think there's like a certain freedom as well, like like if you live in a place where everything is much more strict about how people dance, then something freer, sort of, like even like a waltz, like it just has this incredible appeal, because you don't need to memorize complicated steps. It just feels like, just the pleasure of that movement. But it might, like, it's understandable why it would have clashed at first with the kind of morality of it. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, the waltz was scandalous at its first appearance, and about its earliest in France and Germany. German is not one of my languages. I've done a lot of work on early German material in waltz, but I can say that it was introduced in America as early as, I believe, the 1790s. But as I noted earlier, as late as the 1840s, a woman was still scandalizing people by waltzing with a man. In England, where I know the most about it, it didn't become, I hesitate to say commonly accepted, because it still wasn't commonly accepted, but at least more known and more common until the late 18 teens, mostly in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars and the diplomacy which those involved, which exposed English people to continental customs. It was in England before that. Here and there you see mentions of it, but it most broke into society in the mid to late 18 teens. And it was horrifically scandalous. Lord Byron, who of course was quite the libertine, who was well known for, I guess you could say,
all kinds of things, yeah.
Europe, yes. He was scandalized by the waltz. He devoted an entire poem to how scandalous the waltz was, mostly for the intimate position in which it was danced. While there were other dances like the Allemande from the late 18th century, where you didn't just dance with groups of people making pretty patterns on the floor, for the most part in England, most dancing had been making pretty patterns on the floor, and maybe you touch hands or possibly link arms, but that's about it. So all of a sudden, you've got a dance where you're putting your hands on someone's torso. And not all of the waltzing was in what we think of as sort of the dance sport waltz position where, two hands are joined out in space. Some of it was more the hands are wrapped around the shoulders and his hands are both wrapped around her waist. And when you step, you put your feet between someone else's feet. Yeah. So it wasn't the dance per se, it was the position of the dance. And Byron went on at great length about it, nor was he the only one.
Such a hypocrite, Byron, honestly.
But well, he also had like a deformed foot, like a club foot, a physical disability. So
maybe that was formed a part of his objection. I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's been floated that he was jealous that he couldn't do this, and I haven't actually looked to see if there's a record of him.
Yeah, I mean, he didn't like, from everything I've read about Byron, didn't strike me as a prude, frankly. But
no. But this was doing things that were perceived as private activities, putting your hands on someone else's body. But doing it in public and spinning around while you were doing it, which of course makes you a bit, hot and dizzy. So there was quite a backlash to the waltz. I would never let my sister waltz. I would never let my wife dance with anyone other than me in the waltz. Only a bad woman would waltz. This doesn't seem to have actually stopped too many people from waltzing. It just inspired, letters to the editor and fulminating poems and things like that.
And lots of judgment, yes.
Yes, lots of social judgment. So,
I mean, what will all the gossips do if, we didn't give them fodder?
Well, yeah. And again, it comes back to the sort of classic complaint of, oh my God, what are young people these days doing? Young people are doing dirty dancing. You see this all over the 18th century. The young people, what are they doing? It's so sexual. In the 20th century, you've got jazz, you've got swing, you've got rock and roll. What are those young people doing? In the 80s, you've got lambada, you've got hip hop dancing. Oh my God, it's so sexual. What are young people these days doing? It's amazing how the language doesn't change in the slightest over the past several centuries. It's invariably, there's this new dance thing and young people are doing it and it's outrageous.
I mean, but sometimes it can go the other way as well, like a little bit, when we have periods of greater sort of, but where it's more, everything's more permissible, and then you kind of go into a slightly more strict approach. So like Regency was quite famously, with like in the upper classes at least, with the lead from Prince Prinny, who was he was a degenerate, let's say.
Who was bigamously married to a Catholic, yes, and all of this.
And famously a degenerate. So, everything, including fashions, were like a lot freer than later years. So how did that sort of the changing fashion from Regency to Victorian and the changing morality and sense of like what is proper affect dancing? Were there any dances that were okay in Regency that sort of stopped being okay later?
Question.
Interesting, because there's no one answer.
I wouldn't say that the dancing changed with the morality as much as it did, as I noted before, with the fashion. What you have is a sort of natural cycle of, I guess, what I would call getting bored with grandma's dances. You end up with a period in which dance is sort of static, and you look at dancing and it's basically the same as it was 25 years ago, and it's become sort of fossilized and senescent and not original anymore. And then something changes. And all of a sudden, dance has this period of amazing evolution and new stuff happening and new dances being introduced and everything is different. And then it sort of enters a kind of stasis again. So in the 1820s, really mid 18 teens to the 1820s and 30s, you can see the old dances, the country dances, becoming a sort of senescent form. They're not interesting. They're these old dances we've been doing forever. But quadrilles are interesting. Waltz is interesting. Gallop is interesting.
Mm.
Does it connect to morality? It's hard to say. I definitely feel that there's a notable change in morality. I mean, the Regency is really the last of the Georgian era. It's really sort of the long 18th century. And there is a noted change in morality in the early mid 19th century, what we think of as the Victorian era. How that connects to dancing, it's hard to say, because at the same time as this, you have a shift from mostly dancing in groups to mostly dancing in close hold couple dance position, not just with waltz,
Mm.
but polka, gallop, schottische, things like that. I don't know that I can draw a conclusion about the morality in
Mm.
connection with that change. It seems like it would
Maybe
almost be the
maybe a
opposite,
new
that
area
dancers
of
are getting
research
more
then.
liberty.
I was
Yeah,
wondering,
possibly. I mean, the
um, oh, sorry.
the
Uh,
position does. Oh, I hear you. The position does standardize. You do sort of lose some of the more risque positions that are more like an embrace, and you end up with a more sort of dignified waltz position where you're not supposed to be draped all over each other. But if you look at young dancers in Paris in the 1840s, once again, you have a wonderful supply of illustrations and caricatures showing the dancers doing all sorts of crazy, radical, overly vigorous things where their pieces of their dress fall off and their hair falls down and they're just exhausted. You see that in the lower classes where perhaps morality was a different sort of concern, shall we
mm.
say, than the very protected children of the upper classes. So, yeah, hard to generalize.
Yeah,
Always
I'm
hard
just,
to generalize.
it's always a case, isn't it? But it's just interesting because sometimes you can have the opposite effect to what you'd expect, where like if the morality sort of becomes stricter, then dance might be the one time where people can let loose a little bit, right? So which it would be like the opposite of what you'd expect.
Mhm.
Um,
Yes. Yeah.
we're coming to the end of our hour. So before we go over one question I wanted to ask you, because obviously you mentioned there's just so many TV shows and movies that could really benefit from hiring someone like you to tell them what they're doing wrong. Uh, if Netflix is listening, please implement. Um, are there any like TV shows, like my favorite adaptation of Pride and Prejudice in the 90s, for example, from the 90s? Like, is there anything that you can think of now in terms of like Regency era movies that are like really good in how they represent the dance?
I have to say that this is a subject that gives me enormous pain because, for the most part, they're absolutely terrible. The 1990s adaptation of Pride and Prejudice, the one with Colin Firth, is my absolute favorite. But the dancing is more on what I would call sort of the stately walking model, which
Mm-hmm.
isn't very accurate, which is very frustrating to me because I love everything else about that adaptation. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Contrary-wise, I really, for the most part, despise the one with Keira Knightley. I thought it was horrifically bad. The costumes, especially, gave me a lot of angst. I mean, my mother, who doesn't know anything about costume, walked out of that movie saying, "Is her dress supposed to fit like a potato sack?" And I'm like,
Yeah, I
"No,
mean, no hate to any of the creators of it, but it's not my favorite adaptation either.
it's but but when you see a dance scene, you see people jumping around and hopping and happy and clapping. And I feel like in that moment, they actually captured the
Okay.
quality of the dancing, if not the precise details, which I'm sure I could savage if I really wanted to dig into it. But I felt like that captured the feel of how the country dancing would have looked.
Mm.
better than the ones where everybody is very solemnly like pacing forward in a line toward the camera. It's one of those things that looks great on camera that they really didn't do a lot in this period. The wonderful Regency dances from 1698, which is not the Regency period. So while I can't stand the Keira Knightley adaptation in general, I have to say that they did a better job with the dancing there. And it's not the details. Obviously, we're never going to see an adaptation where you understand the time that Jane spends with Mr. Bingley because we spend 45 minutes on screen with the two of them dancing together. It just doesn't happen. You can't do that on television.
Yeah.
But to at least show that the dancing was not a matter of extremely serious people pacing slowly around the room, but that it had this joy, this energy, this fun to it. That there's a reason people liked dancing. It wasn't just a performative social thing. It was actually a fun activity.
Yeah,
I'll nominate that one.
I think, that is a brilliant message to the filmmakers. And I think it makes so much sense, doesn't it? Because that's what you were sort of, talking about. It's like in terms of the storytelling, the detail matters because the detail is the storytelling. And if you don't get it right, then the whole feeling of the scene or the feeling of the story changes dramatically.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Sorry. I can talk about this forever, you realize.
I know, but you realize that, like, out of the many, many questions that I had prepared, I've asked you like 5 and the rest was just extrapolating. So it's just, I could spend another 3 hours talking to you. But thank you so much for coming and for sharing all your knowledge.
Thank you. I love to talk about this stuff, as you can see. So I'd be happy to converse again anytime.
And are there any one question that I just thought of? Can you think of any sources that are more kind of popular science level that writers researching Regency or Victorian dancing can actually benefit from looking at? Aside from your blog, which we will link to at the bottom of the video.
I'm assuming you mean secondary sources, because oddly enough, there are quite a lot of primary sources available, which, do take some work. For Victorian sources, there's a little book called, I believe, The Civil War Ballroom, which was published posthumously by my mentor, Patri Pugliese, who died, unfortunately, prematurely in 2007. Sure. It's a little book. I can send you a link for it, which talks about some Victorian couple dances in fair detail and also some group dances, and has enough material in there to put your own little ball together. Alison Thompson, who is a Jane Austen scholar, has also done some fairly accessible writing about Regency era dances that I guess I would recommend. And of course, I'm very happy if people want to come to my blog, which varies from very accessible to incredibly technical material, but which, I'm always willing
to answer. It's accessible to everyone, from amateur to professional, is what you're saying.
Yes, it's differently accessible in different places with different people, I would say. I do my best, but there's only so much you can do when you're writing about a complicated topic. So I guess I would recommend Patri and Barbara Pugliese's little book for mid-19th century dancing, and I'd recommend Alison Thompson's work for Jane Austen dancing. And I can provide you with links to both of those if that would help.
Please do, and I'll link to them at the bottom of the video as well. So thank you so much again, and it was really a pleasure. Thank you for watching the video. Click like and subscribe if you would like more. It really helps the channel. Thank you, and see you next week.